Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of For the Stars podcast, third season. My loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. This is an amazing episode because David Avallone boards the mothership to discuss Drawing Blood from Image Comics. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Avallone. Thanks so much for coming to For the Stars podcast.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So, my pleasure. So, I always start with a question of inspiration. So, inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
My love for comics. My father was a novelist and a writer, so I grew up in a writer's household. So I think I had an advantage. A lot of people don't have the advantage of knowing that a life in the arts is even possible. And not only possible, but acceptable. I had parents that weren't going to, when your dad is a novelist, he can't shake his fist at you and say, get a real job. Yeah, you first, buddy. You run out and get a real job and I'll be right after you. So, that was always, writing was always part of my life, though. Honestly, I was a filmmaker for years and years and years before I started writing full time. And I still am. But in terms of influences, the first comics I ever read were World War II DC comics, also Marvel's Sergeant Fury. And again, I think that's an influence of my father, who was a World War II veteran. So that felt very, I'm old. I was born in 65. So in the 1970s, war comics were still only talking about something about 25, 30 years ago instead of 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 80 years ago. So that changes the math a little bit. But, as far as direct influence on my comics work and how I make comics and how I write comics. When I was in college was the big 80s renaissance in comics. And everybody talks about Alan Moore and Frank Miller, and Alan and Frank are great. We're on first name basis, I guess. But I give a shout out to Chaykin with American Flag. That was a huge influence on me. Groundbreaking comic. A lot of the things you see in Dark Knight Returns are in American Flag a couple of years earlier. What Starlin was doing at the time, and even before then, Mike Grell, Matt Wagner with Mage and Grendel, Scott McCloud with Zot, and the Hernandez brothers with Love and Rockets. That showed you could do anything. Because whatever you say about Watchmen and Dark Knight, which people obsess over, those are DC superhero comics. No matter how you try to make them something else, they're DC superhero comics. Whereas American Flag is some Philip K. Dick futuristic satire, and Mike Grell is out there, out Ian Fleming with John Sable freelance. And Zot is this it's a superhero comic, but it's this bright, colorful, beautiful thing. And, Starlin with his epic Dread Star Metamorphosis Odyssey thing. So that's a whole, and then you have the Hernandez brothers basically doing Fellini Goes to Mexico in comics, which that's, I think, the real thing. Like, we all grow up with, this is what we think of. This is what we think an art form is capable of. And then we all have a moment where we see the next thing. I mentioned in film, my favorite film when I was a kid was King Kong, which is the greatest adventure movie ever made, 1933. And but when I was a teenager, I saw my first Fellini film and went, oh, you can also make movies about that. It doesn't all have to be thrills and adventure and excitement in that way. You can make a thrilling epic adventure about people hanging out in nightclubs and call it La Dolce Vita. And that's, it's the desire to do both things, the desire to be Howard Hawks and Fellini, the desire to be both Scott McCloud and Chaykin and Starlin, and to try to hit all of those things, to tell a thrilling, exciting, fast moving story that's also real and human and beautiful and makes you think about your own life. You try it every time. You try to hit home run every time you get to the plate. You know what I mean? And that's, to me, that's the home run. Thrills and heart,
Well, kind of interesting you mentioned King Kong, because you talk about how comics move in cycles. King Kong 33, King Kong in the 70s, King Kong back again. When
Yep.
you're thinking about, and then you talk about like the Renaissance of comic books and the British invasion, things of that nature. In that cyclical nature of comic books, where do you think we are now?
That is a hard call. I will say that I think it's an incredibly exciting time in comics. I think that the whole crowdfunding revolution, when you lower the barriers for entry, everyone who enters is not going to be Mozart. So that's okay. But you discover a lot of great new talent. I think, the publishing company I'm with, Dynamite, is kind of on the rise and eating up a lot of the licensed market
Hmm.
and weirdly eating both Disney and Warner Brothers lunch. Because for some reason, DC Comics and Marvel don't want to do every property that their parent companies have. But Nikki knows what to do with them apparently over at Dynamite. But yeah, I think there's more great comics out now than there have been in a really long time. I mean, and the thing is, they're not coming from Marvel and DC. I mean, and there's great stuff coming from Marvel and DC. I'm not meaning to bag on them, but there's all sorts of amazing stuff out there. There's kind of a glut of it, and there's not enough time to read
Mm.
all of it. And there are new talents, new-ish talents. I mean, I say new talents, sometimes someone's been around for a decade and I just haven't read one of their books yet. But there are people out there doing just amazing, groundbreaking, hilarious, fun work. And I'm very lucky to be in the mix now. I don't know what I would have had to if I had come along in the 90s. I actually stopped reading comics in the 90s because I love Art Adams. I think Art Adams is beautiful. Everybody imitating Art Adams bored me to tears. and it hurt my eyes. I'll take that in one book, but in every book I was like, can we calm down on the inking a little bit, everybody? So yeah, I don't know what book with a superhero covered in pouches I could have written in the 90s that I would have been too happy about doing. But
Mm.
where I managed to come in was with Dynamite doing, you know, they did such great work. They do such great work with what I used to call moribund licenses. Um, and the fact that within the first year and a half of writing comics, I was able to write The Shadow and Doc Savage,
Mm.
the heroes of my father's childhood, not even my childhood, but then he passed that stuff along to me. That was a joy. And since then I've gotten to write Zorro and John Carter, Warlord of Mars, and Alan Quatermain, and what I call playing with the action figures is always just delightful.
I will say I've been loving a lot of what Diamond has been doing. Obviously I'm a grown man boy, so I'm buying some of these younger comic books. But for the first time, maybe ever, I'm a hardcore DC comic book fan from back in the day. However, I find myself buying more Dynamite now than DC because I've been buying Gargoyles, been buying Thundercats, was buying. I'm a Darkwing Duck to be honest with you because he was from my childhood,
Sure.
and I'm like, yeah, they're killing it
My
with
friend
that.
Amanda is writing Darkwing Duck, and they're great. They're so much
Yeah.
fun.
the the only thing I hope they do is they keep them going because I hope they don't follow the DC Marvel thing of relaunching every 15, 20 issues, which drives
I
me
don't.
crazy.
I It's hard to tell because look, we all love number ones. I mean,
Yeah,
I just published my Dynamite just published my 38th Elvira comic. And if it was in the 70s, it would have been, or 80s, it would have been Elvira Mr. the Dark 38. But instead, it was Elvira meets H.P. Lovecraft number 5. The fifth, in a series of, I don't know, 6 or 7 5-issue miniseries and one 12-issue miniseries and one 4-issue miniseries
yeah,
and 3 one-shots. It would have been nice if it was all one thing. But I get it. There are people who need to be told, here's a good place to jump on,
yeah,
and convincing them to jump on an issue 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or whatever can be a trick, which is funny too, because one of the greatest innovations in modern comics, as far as I'm concerned, is the inside front cover recap,
mm,
which keeps you away from, that. And I don't blame any of the writers for this, but pick up any X-Men comic from the 80s and the Quinjet is landing on Muir Island, and Cyclops is saying, "Hey, Professor Xavier, who is a powerful telepath, why are we here on Muir Island?" Well, Scott, who shoots beams out of his eyes, as you know, it's like, oh, just tell. Let me figure it out as I go.
Oh, that part is true. I mean, even the best comic books, let's face it, they're not that complicated. You can jump
No.
in within an issue or two. I mean, I have, there was a, I'm one of those people who do believe that TV shows do encourage sometimes comic book buying, at least with the comic book buyers. And I did get sucked into Moon Knight from the TV show, and I picked up, I think, Moon Knight number like 15. And yeah, it took
Mm-hmm.
me an issue, maybe two, to get like what the hell he's fighting. But
Mm-hmm.
you know what? It read well, and you do buy the
Yeah.
third issue, and you think, you know what? Now it makes sense. And now I've been buying it for like 2 years now.
And I also, honestly, to me, that was what I remembered being fun. Like, I think the first issue of John Carter, Warlord of Mars, I picked up from Marvel was 23. Well,
Yeah,
then I had the fun assignment of finding 22 back issues to fill it in. And even then, you're like not getting the back issues in order. So you're filling in a little bit
yeah.
here, a little bit there. And it's a cool puzzle. And it's okay not to be led by the hand and to not know exactly what's going on. Movie going, as you probably know, like up until Psycho, you went to the movies at whatever time you felt like going to the movies,
Yeah.
and you sat down in the middle of whatever was happening. And if you were lucky, it was the newsreel or the cartoon or the trailers. But if you were unlucky, you were an hour into the feature film, or you were an hour into the B picture, and you looped it. You stayed in the movie theater until you got back. And if it was a good movie, you stayed to the end of it the second time.
Yeah.
When I would watch television with my dad as a kid, we'd be watching some Marx Brothers movie, and he would go, "This is where I walked in." Like every movie he remembered, this is the first scene I saw from this Gary Cooper movie. This is the first scene I saw from this Humphrey Bogart movie. And imagine trying to unlock the Maltese Falcon if this was the first scene you saw and you had no idea what was going on. And that's a fun intellectual exercise. I think it's a generational thing too. I don't know if you follow the Criterion channel, but they just introduced something that I think is Gen X catnip, which is, in addition to their library, which you can scroll around and choose a great movie and watch it, they have a channel on their streaming platform that you just click on it and you go, "Oh, this is the 400 blows." Okay. We're about 40 minutes into we turned it on last night. I was like, this is the Samurai. This is Le Samurai, the Alan Delon picture. And I love playing Name That Expensive Foreign Film game with it. But there's something about Gen X. I think we like the idea of the TV going, how about an hour of Avengers Endgame?
Yeah,
Great. That's what's on. I'll watch it.
I agree. I mean, when I used to have regular cable, because now everything's streaming for me, but when I had regular cable, you turn on the TV, and if you recognize it, it's usually start off like I would be doing something, starts on the peripheral. You kind of
Yeah.
look here, you kind of look it over, you're like, all right, that's interesting. You're kind of doing your thing, and then you start to notice your head turns more and more over until you forgot what
Yeah.
time it was.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was something to be said for that. The movies that were good, regardless of when you started it, were still good.
Yeah.
They still
Yeah.
eventually sucked you in.
And any movie that you've seen, more than a couple of times, movies are only really about narrative surprise once.
Right.
And when they're not about narrative surprise, then they're about, you know, paying attention and watching and learning things and, looking at a different aspect of it and looking at it a different way. And that's a joy. There's a lot to be said for it.
Mm. And
There's a lot to be said for it.
I agree 100%. Like, just not to beat the horse, but just to mention, I buy Spawn. I started buying Spawn at issue 298. So I bought Spawn a little bit at the beginning, but 354 issues up to now. They didn't renumber it, and you still kind of figure it out. I mean, it's not. It's a cool concept that you bump into, and
Yep.
eventually you figure out the details. The details are often not as important as the character itself. Is
Sure.
it an entertaining character? Does it look entertaining? Is he doing interesting things? And then you figure out the
Right.
why later.
Well, and also, and I say with all the love in the world for long running comics, it's like, maybe you didn't read the first appearance of Doctor Doom in the Fantastic Four, but if you pick up the Fantastic Four tomorrow, Doctor Doom will be along presently.
Exactly.
Like he'll Galactus will show up at some point. Like maybe you're familiar with the story, maybe you're not. There is a tendency for continuities to start eating their own tail,
Yeah.
and I think also there's a tendency for me to drop out of comics when it's like, okay, this is the third time Jean Grey has come back from the dead. I am now exhausted from all of the times Jean Grey has come back from the dead.
Yeah.
I don't need to see this storyline done. This writer wants to redo the thing that they loved in their own way, and great. But I don't. I'm good. I can tap out.
I agree with you. I've said this before on the show. I'll say it again because I like to brag a little bit. I have every Green Lantern comic book ever written from 1960 to now, every single
Wow.
version of it. And I am at the point where, having bought the comic books now, reading them now for the last 30 years, where I do recognize, didn't they do that already?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure I've seen that one already.
Yeah.
But, you know,
And the thing is, like, I used to be more interested in continuity, and the older I get, the more I think continuity is overrated.
hmm,
And because it's never about what is the plot, it's always about what is the story. If you have a new take on a story, if you have an idea about Galactus that you think Jack Kirby and Mark Waid didn't have, go wild, man. Like
hmm,
tell your Galactus story. Nothing wrong with that. Because someone will read it who has never heard of Jack Kirby. Someone will read it who has never heard of Mark Waid. And this thing that we must constantly cater to the people who've been reading it from number one, that those dinosaurs are dying off the face of the earth. Like that, it's like I know those people exist. I
yeah,
think Wade is one of them, but it's such a small readership
hmm,
that I think it's silly to just chase it and chase it and chase it. And I actually like the jumping in and just telling the story you want to tell with the characters. I had an epiphany the other day about the continuity issues in the of all things the Mad Max movies. And I realized that with the exception of the first movie, the continuity errors don't matter because all three of those stories are being told to us by someone at a remove of many years.
hmm,
The feral kid is telling us the Road Warrior. That's how he remembers it. Thunderdome is being told to us by what's her name? Anna Goanna in the ruins of Sydney around a campfire.
hmm,
That's how she remembers it. Furiosa is being told by the old man with the writing on his skin. That's how he remembers it.
yeah,
And that's fine. And I really think that's a great it kind of lets you get away with anything continuity wise, and it gets away with you even repeating ideas in multiple movies because Miller
hmm,
has done that of having a scene happen again because it's just a scene he particularly likes, having a line of dialogue reoccur. It's like these are oral histories that we're seeing as movies, and I don't. Anytime you write something, if you know what you're doing, you have an idea of whose perspective it is, even
hmm,
if it's not in first person singular.
yeah,
If it like Drawing Blood is in first person singular, it is Shane Bookman telling the story. And I'm a big believer. I do not cheat. There are no scenes in that comic that Shane Bookman is not in or witnessing. You're either
hmm,
seeing him or you're seeing what he's seeing or you're seeing what he's remembering or you're seeing what he's imagining. We don't have a scene of two characters that aren't him talking about him somewhere else
right, right.
because he doesn't know that. And he's
Well,
the guy telling us the story.
but what I did like about Drawing Blood is that you say a lot without the exposition dump. As you mentioned, there's not a character
Thank
who
you.
goes, "This has been my life," and over you will notice that blah 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 has
Yeah.
happened. Over like you kind of the story is told. It's a little bit in media res that it's kind of in the middle of the it's
Yeah.
not. You kind of feel like you're in the middle of his life, something major happening. You're not starting at the beginning like this is my idea for the play. So now I'm going to talk
Yeah.
about the plan, and then everything happens. Like everything's kind of already in motion, and now you're
Yeah.
jumping in where things are already on the run. Is
Yeah.
that
Well,
correct?
you have to have a little bit of faith and confidence in what's important to tell the audience up front, what they need to know, and what you figure they can pick up.
Mm,
Like, yeah, the comic does not begin with Shane Bookman is a 40-something-year-old man who created $1 billion global franchise. The first indication you get of that is Beastly points at the billboard and says you can't escape it everywhere you go.
yeah.
if you're reading the book cold and don't know anything about it, all you know in that moment is that this guy who's doing this weird thing that maybe it's a drug deal, who knows what it is, with Lithuanian gangsters, uh, created something that there's a billboard with a cat on it and 4 R's, and what does it all mean? And there's a quote from the writer director Billy Wilder where he says, if you let the audience add 2 and 2 together and get 4, they will love you because you have made them feel smart,
Mm.
you know. And you just, to me, that's what, the goal of that kind of writing. People don't stop and explain everything that happened to them to lead up to a certain moment. People
Yeah.
don't explain how everything works. So you trust the audience to, by the end of the first book, they go, okay, so he created this thing, it was a big hit, now he's broke, and he started up a publishing company. And as the issues go on, you learn that he sold the rag dolls to our universe's version of Nickelodeon, which is called Kitty Scope. You learn that he has a shitty relationship with his brother Paul, who's his co-creator. You learn, and by the way, I have seen reviews of Drawing Blood that conflate his business partner Frank with his brother who co-created the Ragdolls. Like
Mm.
they haven't figured out that that's 2 different people yet. But that doesn't. It's there. I think by issue 4 or 5, they'll figure out those are 2 different people. But it's like I said, it's okay for them to sort of be doping out. Oh, his assistant, he's got this big goofy assistant. Oh, his assistant was the voice of Miyazaki in the cartoon that they did in the
Mm.
90s. Oh, okay. Like just all, Beastly is the guy he shares an art studio with at his publishing company. Um, it's fun to, when you sit down, you write, I have somewhere a timeline that specifically says in this year they create the rag dolls, in this year they meet Frank Forrest at a convention and he encourages uh Shane to keep drawing. In this year they publish their first issue and it becomes a big deal. And this year there's a cartoon series. In this year he meets Crystal and they get married and divorced. Like I know when all of that stuff happens in a continuum, but the comic is not interested in telling you that story in order because it's not the story we're telling. It's just the backstory.
Now, there's an aspect of the story that maybe I'm right or wrong in perceiving it this way. It's a little nihilistic. As far as it's kind of grim, and it's subtitled "The Story Behind the Stories." So, from the point of view of the world of comic book writing, how much is this the story behind what it's like to be in the headspace of these
You
comic book
know,
writers?
my favorite reaction to this book ever. We actually had the honor of I asked Matt Wagner to cover for issue 7. And Matt's known Kevin since the 80s.
Yeah.
And I sent him all the scripts and all the published issues we had so that he could know what to, what the whole story was and choose a cover image that he wanted to draw. And the first email I got back from him is, dude, I have so many questions. And, writ large, it is all very fictionalized. Kevin Eastman has never been in a gunfight with Lithuanian gangsters.
That he's going to admit to.
But there is, yeah, right. But in show business, we have all dealt with crooks, and sometimes guns are drawn by crooks. And we have been, Kevin and I mean, it's the broad outlines are mostly Kevin. Some of the more detailed stuff is me. I mean, just as a sheer example, the Lithuanian gangsters, in the first draft, they were Russian gangsters, and Kim was like, "Isn't that a little cliche?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." One of my best friends, my mentor who passed away, was named Adolphus and was Lithuanian, and he had a brother named Jonas, and they were both hilarious guys with a very peculiar speech pattern. And I went, I want to write, instead of Russians, let's go with Lithuanian gangsters, and they will have that funny speech pattern that Adolphus and Jonas had.
Hmm.
And little things like that. Interestingly, Kevin and I, though we only met about 8 years ago, we had there are some weird overlaps in our biography. I was working for the company that made the first Ninja Turtles movie, like right up until about a month before they made the Ninja Turtles movie. I was working for the low budget film director who introduced Kevin to his wife, his ex-wife, now deceased, Julie Strain. I made 2 movies with that guy and then quit. And then the next movie was where Kevin meets him. So like we have these weird, like we know a lot of the same people, even though we weren't there at the same time. So it made it easy for us to overlap things. But yeah, the 4th issue, which comes out, this will air after it, but Wednesday the 31st, is one of the few things from the actual real world that I said to Kevin, we have to fictionalize that. It's too funny. And it's about the Michael Bay saying the turtles are not going to be turtles, they're going to be aliens. He gave this whole ridiculous interview and then he had to backtrack from it. But part of the story at the time is that they had Kevin go out and say, no, man, to the fans and say, don't worry about it. They're totally going to be turtles in the movie. So I turned that into an issue of Drawing Blood that takes place at New York Comic Con. And again, like, I've been to New York Comic Con. Like it's, all of those experiences are fed by them being mutual experiences that Kevin and I both understand. But in terms of it, it is not a 1-for-1. This is the true story of the Ninja Turtles. Like it's not that. And one of the ways, actually, in issue 4, there's a little Easter egg. One of the things we wanted to do to really undermine the idea that Shane Bookman is Kevin Eastman. In issue 4, there's a scene where Shane Bookman is entering a panel room at New York City Comic Con and runs into Kevin Eastman, me, and Ben Bishop. And there's a funny thing that Ben did, which I love, which is Kevin and Shane are greeting each other in the foreground, and in the background, Ben is standing there with the book open, and I'm pointing to something on the page. And as far as Ben is concerned, that's me saying to Ben, "Oh, we're here now. We're on page 16 of issue 4. We made it. This is our cameo scene. Look." And Kevin's wife is standing in the background, Courtney Eastman. So we really wanted to, when we were developing it, I think the first name that Shane Bookman had was Kirby Miller. From Kevin's version of the story before he brought me on. And I said, the thing is, I get the tribute you're doing there, but this comic is going to take place in the real world, and we may end up talking about Jack Kirby and Frank Miller. So let's not make comic book writer, character, actor, artist references in our character names. We can't have a character named Sienkiewicz because Bill Sienkiewicz might be in a scene, because we want to use the real people of comic books as much as we possibly can, because it's funny and it's fun, and so yeah, and Kevin agreed with me, and we shifted away from doing those kind of tributes and character names. Now they're tributes to other things.
Well, at least a lot of readers will make that comparison between Eastman, because obviously the characters that Bookman creates are the radically rearranged Ronin Ragdolls, which is obviously everyone who knows the Mutant Ninja Turtles knows the connection. He had a partner that had a falling out. Eastman had a falling out with his. Is the story satirical or more allegorical on the process, and how would you look at it from that point of view?
I mean, I don't think of it as satirical so much as like it's comic and it's dramatic, but it's not. When you do satire, you're attempting to sort of expose the flaws in a thing, and I think this is more just we're trying to be honest about what this life is like and what a life in the professional arts is like, whatever they are. Because Kevin and I have both been involved in movies, we've both been involved in television, we've both been involved in comic books. And we just wanted to tell a recognizable story to us that takes place in this world. There are a lot of nakedly autobiographical comic books out there. This isn't Harvey Pekar. This is not, this isn't Persepolis. We're not trying to tell that kind of story. We're trying to tell a story about a guy who could conceivably inhabit the world that we live in, who moves in the world that we move in, and has the same sad, happy, funny, serious, tragic, it's like, it's not meant to be. One of the things that was a big inspiration for the series for Kevin, because I think it really shook him, is there was an interview with Wally Wood, the great Wally Wood, where someone asked him, some fanboy question about what's it like being a legend in the comics industry? And he said, if I had known what being a comic book professional would have been like, I would have cut my drawing hand right off, which is dark.
Hmm.
And that's while he did commit suicide, that's not how he did it. And Kevin told me that story, and I said, so the inciting incident that kicks off the story is what if, Kevin co-created, or founded, I should say, did this mostly on his own, founded a company called Tundra, which in our comic is called Siberia Arts. Um, and eventually took on a business partner, Dennis Kitchen, and Dennis did not commit suicide. But I sort of was like, well, what if Dennis Kitchen, what if instead of it being Dennis Kitchen, you had gone to an old, bitter comics pro? What if you had gone to a Jack Kirby or a Bill Finger, or a Wally Wood to be and he committed suicide by
Hmm.
cutting off his drawing hand, and how much that shakes you. Um, so like that's an example of the Wally Wood cutting off the hand thing is a thing from an interview. And then in the real world, he committed suicide. And then in the real world, Kevin founded this company and it went bust and he lost $9 million.
Hmm.
Uh, Partly because of partners he couldn't rely on. Dennis is not one of those partners, by the way. It was more that honestly, the artists and the writers he was working with didn't deliver for him.
Hmm.
And the comic book industry writ large kind of blacklisted the books to keep them off the market. There was a lot of shenanigans. But all that to say, it's like that's an example of here's a pile of things that happened in the real world.
Hmm.
I put them in the art blender and came up with this version where no, that's not Dennis Kitchen and no, that's not Tundra, and all of the details are different, but the inspiration is this thing, you know?
Now, when you think about Bookman and his situation, because obviously he's not living his best life,
No,
or he was for a little while maybe living his best life, but
yeah.
it ended. Is he a victim of ambition, hubris, or the industry itself?
I would say he's actually more a victim of his own in experience. Uh, Kevin became very, very wealthy at a very young age.
Hmm.
He wasn't 40, he wasn't 50, he was, 22 or something when he was, and he very quickly went from being a guy who just dreamed about making comics when he grew up to the CEO of a multinational corporation that spent his days okaying toy designs and box art and scripts for a TV show and had very little time to sit down and draw comics. And it's about, you know, I don't know that it's, Siberia Arts is a touch of hubris, thinking, oh, I'll reinvent the comic book industry myself,
Hmm.
just as Tundra was a touch of hubris. And I don't think Kevin would ever, Kevin knows how much folly was involved in that. But it is a tough thing to pursue this line of work, and
Hmm.
you have to be prepared for the this is a comic book about a roller coaster. It's about a
Hmm.
guy who gets on a roller coaster when he's not quite tall enough to be on the ride, and it goes very high very fast, and then when it drops he is completely unprepared for the drop, which is the hard thing.
Hmm.
I started out, I didn't make millions of dollars before I was 25. So the drops are very, very familiar to me. I get more confused by the ups. So, but that I think is one of the things, honestly, that makes the book work is Kevin and I have very similar experiences and also very, very different experiences.
Hmm.
So we're both able to see the ups and the downs, literally, from two perspectives. But aside from that, we're both very simpatico and see the world the same way and see the business the same way. And it's that thing of like, we love this thing and we love the art part of it. And the business part of it is the unavoidable part of it.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Drawing Blood is about a guy who's lost his will to draw. And it's the only thing he ever wanted in his life. And it's about, not to give away the 12 issue arc, but it's
Hmm.
about how do you find your way back to the art when show business has eaten every minute of your life? How do you find your way back to the simple joy of sitting at the drawing board and drawing comic book pages?
Well, also to make maybe a slight allusion as well too. So with Bookman, he creates radically rearranged Ronin Ragdolls. He seems to, on some level, resent that creation. On some level, I mean, he makes it, but at some point, he feels like a resentment to it. A resentment maybe because he, I think, viewed maybe as a one-hit wonder, even though he has all these other creative things he's trying to do.
Hmm.
Um, thinking about Mr. Eastman, and he creates this massive Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is one of the biggest
Yep.
properties of the last 40 years, probably. And everything he does is always going to be measured against that moment.
Absolutely.
Is that how Bookman is looking at his
Well,
previous
the
project?
thing I'll say about Bookman is I separate how he feels about the ragdolls as the characters
Mm,
because they do appear as characters in the book in his hallucinations, and the ragdolls as a business empire.
mm,
He resents the business empire. He resents the fact that he's, you know, getting paid to consult on a big dumb Hollywood movie with CGI ragdolls. Uh, but in the hallucinations, you'll notice he always loves the girls. Even when
mm,
Atomo is beating up on him, he's not mad at he because on some level he knows that they're just the ragdolls are him. He
mm,
can't hate them. They're his creation. So even when Atomo is beating the snot out of him, he doesn't get mad at Atomo. He's just sad that his own creation is mad at him.
mm,
He's sad. It's that thing of you create something that's beautiful and you want to keep it pure. And in your mind, in his mind, they're still the three girls from the first issue of Radically Rearranged Ronin Ragdoll. They're still pure. They're not. Originally, I'd considered that every time he'd see them. This was when we were thinking about it as a TV show. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if sometimes they're like giant action figures, and sometimes they're very two-dimensional Saturday morning cartoon characters, and sometimes they're big, ugly Michael Bay CGI. And I was like, no. In his imagination, they should always be pure. They should always be his original idea of what
mm,
the ragdolls would look like, and not any other version. And yeah, he has a great fondness for them. He just doesn't know how to get to them through all of the muck
mm,
of making a living on them. And I think every that's the universe to the degree that the story is universal. The universal part is we all, all artists just want to make art for a living, but there's no world in which you're allowed to do that.
mm,
Perfect example. I love San Diego Comic Con, but whether I like it or not, I got to go to San Diego for 5 days. I got to see all the right people. I got to shake all the right hands. I did 7 panels. I gotta spread myself thin as butter on toast just to, to perpetuate, just so that people will let me keep coming home, sitting at my desk and writing.
mm,
No one's going to let you just do that. You
mm,
know what I mean? You actually have to meet the editors at parties and shake their hands and say, "Hey, I'd love to do a book with your company, and here, read this writing sample and all that." And look, I'm lucky. I am outgoing and chatty, and that stuff is second nature to me. And I feel this is an industry with a lot of introverts, and that part must be incredibly difficult and painful for them. And I have sympathy for that because there are definitely, I wake up and go, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have to, I don't want to have to shake the hand. I don't want to have to, dance monkey dance. There's a great story that William Goldman has a great book about show business and screenwriting called Adventures in the Screen Trade. And he talks about hanging out with George Siegel, big movie star in the 70s. And Siegel looks at his watch. It's like the afternoon and says, "Oh shit, I gotta go record. I gotta go do Johnny Carson." And Goldman is very surprised. He's like, "I've seen you on Carson. You laugh and you tell jokes and you play the banjo and you have a great time." And he looks and he says, Siegel looked at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world and said, I have to do that. If I want to continue to be a movie star,
mm,
I gotta go on Carson and make it look like I'm having the time of my life doing this free TV gig that I am not getting paid for or compensated for my time. It's like, I
right,
don't, sure, some days you're up for it, but some days you're like, I don't. I don't want to go be fucking, I don't want to go be hilarious and shiny and wonderful. Can I not? Can I just be
Hmm.
a lump? It'd be great to just be allowed to be a lump. So, it's it's the other side of the coin. And it is the side that destroys sensitive young dudes like the Shane Bookmans of the world who just want to sit in their bedroom and draw dinosaurs.
Hmm.
And then the dinosaurs become the most popular thing in the world. And you're like, and then it's like head down to the factory at 6 a.m. to time to draw the dinosaurs, and that happens to everyone. If you look at uh like Ian Fleming and Sherlock Holmes, or I should say Ian Fleming and Conan Doyle, both tried to kill James Bond and Sherlock Holmes multiple times in multiple books because they were like, well, people maybe let me stop doing this and I can do like, and they loved James Bond and Sherlock Holmes to a degree, but there comes a moment where it becomes like, I gotta figure out something else to do with James Bond and Sherlock Holmes now. Okay. And look, we should all be so lucky as to create something so iconic that people will not let us stop doing it. And Kevin with The Last Ronin proved that he still got it 100%
Hmm.
and that he could deliver. I always describe The Last Ronin to people who haven't read it as what if George Lucas came back after 20 years and The Phantom Menace was the greatest Star Wars movie ever made?
It made a lot of people happy.
You know, that's what The Last Ronin is. He came back to the Turtles after decades. I mean, he had input on the IDW books, obviously, and shaped that run a bit. But that was weren't his baby the way that Last Ronin was his baby.
Hmm.
And and that is a hard thing to do, but he managed to do it. And drawing blood is a thing that he just had in his back pocket. And San Diego Comic-Con 2016, when we had
Hmm.
known each other about 8 months, we were having a drink at the Bayfront Hilton. And he said, I've been kicking around this thing since 2005, like literally a decade, and I've never cracked it. And I hate the title. And would you read it and look at my notes, and I'll give you some background information and see if you can come up with something.
Hmm.
And he was very kind to put something so incredibly valuable to him in my hands.
Hmm.
And it is my proudest work. I am, I am enough of an egomaniac. I think all my stuff is really good, but Drawing Blood is something else. There are not a lot of comic books. I don't know that there's another comic book out there like it,
Hmm.
where it's a show business comedy drama. The closest analog I can come to it is if All That Jazz was about a comic book artist instead of about a Broadway choreographer.
Hmm.
It's got a lot of All That Jazz in it, or Fellini's 8.5 for that matter.
So, what can readers look forward to in the upcoming issues of Drawing Blood?
Well, issue 4 is New York City Comic Con and the fixing the PR disaster. In issue 5, which will be out at the end of August, Bookman and Beastly head out to Hollywood, California to visit the set of the new gritty Ragdolls movie, and shenanigans bust out.
Very nice.
Yeah, basically the New York Comic Con issue in my mind. That's the first trade, first 4 issues. That's the first arc. The second arc is 5 through 8, which is, for want of a better term, it gets super dark. Issue 8 is incredibly dark, and then 9 through 12 is the road back from that. The first arc trade will be out in October, and it's called Spilled Ink. Drawing Blood Spilled Ink. The second arc trade, I don't know when that'll be out, but that's called Rough Layouts. And the third, I don't know what it's called yet. I think I was kicking around some titles the other day and with an executive at Image, and I was like, I don't know, Final Letters, and they were like, oh, that's good. So like maybe fine. Like I'm trying to name them after
Hmm.
the parts of making a comic book. Lettering draft. I don't know. I'll call the fourth issue something. Um, but they're the third arc, I should say. But yeah, we got some. It's a story I'm incredibly proud of, and I think it's worth people reading. And when the first trade comes out, we haven't republished the with Image, we have not republished the Ragdoll's first issue. And the trade has the Ragdoll's first issue in it. And it should also have the GTFO. In the fourth issue, I wanted to, it's a book about people who make comic books, right? So we meet Shane Bookman, who created an early 90s Funny Animals Doing Martial Arts sensation comic book. His mentor, Frank Forrest, created something called The Night Avenger in the 50s, who's kind of a Batman, the spirit kind of thing. And it was all taken away from him, and he made very little money on it, and he's very bitter about it. In the fourth issue, we meet Amanda Cavallina, who is a teenage tattooed webcomics creator who has a webcomic called GTFO Girl. And she has a really meaningful interaction with Bookman, which is kind of the generations looking at each other and what have we done and what are we doing. And then I thought it would be fun, and Kevin backed me up on this. I reached out to Amanda Dibert, who is where I grabbed the name Amanda from in the first place. And I asked her to write a 4-page GTFO Girl comic. And then I asked a great artist named Skylar Patridge to draw the 4-page GTFO Girl. And that is the backup feature in Drawing Blood #4. And I like the fact Image actually reached out to me and like, so we don't have the second part of GTFO Girl for issue 5. I was like, oh no, we're not doing that in every issue. We don't have that kind of money to be adding 4 more pages to the book every month. This was just something I wanted to do so that people would go, hey, I'd kind of like to see more of GTFO Girl. Just like I'm actually trying to work out Night Avenger, as I said, is our sort of our in-universe Batman character. And there's an artist named Dave Acosta who we did a 1-page Night Avenger Sunday comic strip, newspaper comic strip that was in issue 2. And Dave and I are talking about doing the 1989 Marvel Comics adaptation of the Tim Burton Night Avenger movie.
Very cool.
Like some 40-page. I told Dave, like, draw it like Sal Buscema rushing it, rushing it and phoning it in. I want that Raiders of the Lost Ark really rushed, comics adaptation of a big movie thing. We'll probably get around to it. It'll probably be 40 or 60 pages. And we'll get around to that sooner rather than later. But that is the extent of the Bookman verse. And we do have in the tank 4 more issues of Ragdolls, 2 of which have gone to the second round of Kickstarter supporters. And the second one is we'll release them someday. The other thing that I want to do, if we ever have the time, money, and want to be this ridiculous, is we're all friends with Scott Dunbier, who's the editor behind those incredible IDW treasury editions, the artisan editions that are 3 feet by 2. They're enormous, and it's the original art and everything. And Scott just recently struck out on his own with his own publishing company, and I really want to do an in-universe Scott Dunbier presents the Ragdolls artisan edition, with the oversized art and the original sketch pages and all that kind of stuff. I think that would be hilarious. We love the sort of, in the first Kickstarter campaign, we kind of played with the idea that Shane Bookman was a real thing and the Ragdolls were a real sensation in the early 90s. And a couple of people were like, were they on Nickelodeon? And I think people were conflating like the Samurai Cats and the Powerpuff Girls in their head, and going, I vaguely remember something that was almost this, but not exactly this. And it's like, no, man, we completely made this up. Uh, didn't really happen. You're not forgetting Shane Bookman. He didn't actually exist.
Well, like I said, I've really enjoyed reading
Thank
Drawing
you, Jim.
Blood, and I wanted to just thank you so much for doing this, and thank you. Have a great, appreciate it very much, sir.
Thank you.
Have a very good night.
You too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Furthest Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Please return for the next episode with Michelle Bursky and Kevin Henthorn for the Mothership discuss Terminator Zero on Netflix. Until next voyage, travel on.